Hi, I'm Cynthia Elise Smith, and the doctor is in. Hi, I'm Dr. Cynthia Elise Smith, and I am an anti racism, anti white supremacism educator and essayist specializing in essays, presentations, and video lectures with alternative views on race, race as color, race as character, racism, and white supremacy. I offer deeper, more critical perspectives on these subjects, including the potential implications of racialized wording in the US language lexicon that are not ordinarily considered. Now, I'm not here to change any minds. However, I am here to make you think and think critically about the subject matter I'm about to present. As you critically think, perhaps you will begin to change your own mind. Understand that this lecture is designed to make you think, but it may not be comfortable for you. Now, before I begin, you will need three critical thinking tools to use throughout this lecture. I call them the three C's of navigating through the language system of racism and white supremacy. Comprehension. This is the most important because it is the essence of understanding what you are saying, being told, writing, or reading, or the ability of one's mind to form and craft imagery and concepts from the words. Context. Second only to comprehension, but only in numerical designation because it's just as important, is the essence of understanding what you are saying, being told, writing, or reading, or the ability of one's mind to form and craft imagery and concepts from the words. This is going to be very important while listening and watching this lecture. Try to stay within the context, especially when we get to the interactive question part, because it's easy because there's so much involved with race, racist color, racist character, racism, and white supremacy that is easy to get off the focus and end up on some other focus, some other framing. Now, last but not least is connotation. Oh, connotation is so important. It's the ability of the words to summon emotion or an idea or feeling that a word involves in addition to its literal or primary meaning. Now, what do I mean about that? Why is connotation so important? Connotation is particularly important because it is the feeling of the words. Did you get it? Get what I'm saying? It's the feeling of the words. It's the expressive part. It's the part of the words, sentences, and paragraphs from thought which create the drama and cause people to react happily, sadly, violently, or otherwise. So think about those three very important tools as you go through this lecture. Now, I'll not be able to see the chat or view the chat during the lecture. However, for those who remain after the lecture, take notes, because after the lecture we'll have an interactive session where you can either come up as a panel. Most of the people who are on here um, do know already about panels and things like that. So you could come up on a panel and discuss it, or you can just ask questions inside the chat, and I will let you know how to ask the questions so that I see that they're questions. Okay. All right. Well, without further ado, let's talk about euphemisms and dog whistles. Before we begin, I want you to hit the like, place my page into your feed quickly to update you whenever I do a presentation, a video essay, a lecture, or go live. Now, while the following information is being taken from my book, White Supremacy and the Post-Racial Colorblind Era, Exploring Visible and Invisible Whiteness in the United States, an unbleached, unbooked look, you will not need the book to follow along. For anyone who has the book, it will be section 4.2, Racial Euphemisms and Racial Dog Whistles, found on page 80. But it's okay if you don't have the book, because I will be taking information directly from it for you. This lecture is not meant to provide a detailed explanation for each and every racialized euphemism or dog whistle in the entire vernacular of white American English. Suffice to say, these few were included to help spur thinking and more critical analysis of those words, terms, and phrases not necessarily considered as softer, kinder words used by liberals and progressives, nor the signals used by white supremacists and racists, in much the same way that euphemisms and dog whistles were substituted for white and whiteness. Euphemisms and dog whistles were also used to substitute black and blackness. The post racial colorblind era was replete with euphemisms, dog whistles, and metaphors, all used to mask whiteness in America, whether intended or not, both with regard to the status of white people as superior and the system of racism designed to support that status. Oxford and other dictionaries defined a euphemism as a mild or indirect word or expression substituted for one considered to be too harsh or blunt when referring to something unpleasant or embarrassing. Of the many euphemisms out there are some whose initial reaction upon hearing, seeing, writing, or reading might not be thought of as such. Even old words, which today could be considered splitting verbal hairs, may be used as euphemisms. As explained in the first lecture in this series, and the two words I believe are a great example, take the words minority and majority, both of which appear to have no value other than numeric in US culture or even in the world outside the system of racism. The nation's democratic belief in majority rule is rooted in the numerical value of people in American politics, where the numerical majority in terms of political power rules. In the US, as in the counting of people in groups, even when differentiating white from and the system of racism, the value of these words literally changes, and one's comprehension interpretations of the words change. If one were to dissect the root of minority to the word minor, the synonyms slight, small, unimportant, insignificant, inconsequential, inconsiderable, of little account, peripheral, subsidiary, negligible, trivial, trifling, paltry, and petty come into piercing focus. Conversely, the root of the word majority is major or crucial, vital, great, considerable, paramount, utmost, prime, extensive, important, serious, or significant. In determining how the root changes the context with the addition of the suffix ity, or an instance or degree of a quality or condition, as in a state of being, that's what that ity suffix means. Itty. Okay? That's what that means. And it's a suffix and it means the quality or state of being. It forms a noun of the two root words. It can and must be concluded then that in a racialized America, when people consider themselves by the term minority or identify others as a minority, what is actually being read, said, written, or heard is the value of the minority person as a euphemism for, guess what? Slight, small, unimportant, insignificant, inconsequential, inconsiderable, of little account, peripheral, subsidiary, negligible, trivial, trifling, paltry, and petty. By contrast, the euphemism for the value of the majority person becomes ruled by persons who are crucial, vital, great, considerable, paramount, utmost, prime, extensive, important, serious, or significant. Moreover, its numerical significance is lost altogether and becomes, guess what? The degree or quality or condition and state of being of the referenced person. Majority, ity, makes it a person, place, or thing. Okay? Minor, ity, makes it a person, place, or thing. Okay? So when you're saying the minorities, you're putting yourself down. Just so you know. Now, rather than using color-based designations to describe the condition of black people, words like underfunded, underserved were used, where the prefix under was meant to suggest the reality of black people as disproportionately under everything and not above anything. Still others, such as bad or sketchy or urban, were euphemisms to describe black neighborhoods. The ethnonym African American easily became a euphemism for white and black people who preferred not to associate racist color to black skin. It was also a way for educated and intelligent, upwardly mobile, and economically successful black people to remove race as color as a descriptor in conversations with white people or each other. Although popularized in the 1980s by Jesse Jackson, the term African American was already used in American discourse to identify black people as early in America as early as 1835. However, its use during the post racial colorblind era served for many decades as a veil, providing both black and white people another way to identify newly ambiguously colorless black bodies. Whether inadvertently or with other intentions, the use of this term to describe black people further perpetuated the notion of black skin invisibility throughout the post racial colorblind era and still serves as a buffer for both white and black people who are still squeamish about the use of race as color. Now, I just want to, as an aside, tell you that the post racial colorblind era is the period between that I call the post racial colorblind era is the period between 1964, when the Civil Rights Act was signed, amended in 1968 to include housing, and when Trump was installed as president in 2017. The term mainstream is extremely common in US language today that it is almost always missed for what it actually denotes when used. The US definition for mainstream is quite telling. The ideas, attitudes, or activities that are regarded as normal or conventional, the dominant trend in opinion, fashion, or the arts. Within the very definition, other euphemisms abound, such as normal and conventional. One key word in the definition sums up the quality, focus, and justification for its use as a word to hide its inherent superiority, and that word is dominant. Therefore, mainstream is a white word used to hide whiteness as the main and dominant stream within the stream of culture in the United States. For white people living during the post racial colorblind era, a major euphemism to describe them was the term Caucasian. Today, white people are Caucasians. Many identify most frequently by this term, and many prefer it to being called white. In an article entitled Why Do We Keep Using the Word Caucasian?" writer Yolanda Moses discussed the term, how it arose, and why. She explained it expanded out of a, quote, growing 18th century European science of racial classification. She stated the term was coined by Johann Blumenbach, a German anatomist, after a visit to the Caucasus Mountains. Apparently, quote, he must have been enchanted by the people there, labeling them Caucasians and proposing they were, quote, created in God's image as an ideal form of humanity. I had to let, anyway, yeah, that's what he did. Johann Blumenbach said that these Caucasians were created in God's image as an ideal form of humanity. As a sort of validation of Blumenbach's rationale for God's image of humanity, Moses explained that among the four race categories, Blumenbach believed, other than the white category, each were physically and morally degenerate forms of God's original creation. So everybody else were degenerates. And therefore, the term Caucasian was an appropriate way to justify whiteness as superior. In the early years of the U.S. colonies through the 1960s, Caucasian and the color white for white skin were interchangeable. Caucasian was employed less frequently prior to the onset of the post racial colorblind era, and the term white was more widely used to describe themselves. According to Moses, early on, Caucasian had posed a problem since Blumenbach's grouping of racist color also included some North Africans, meaning, Egyptians and things like that, people like that, Armenians, Persians, Arabs, and North Indians. So people from India, from the north of India, in India. Therefore, given the potential for obvious problems posed by the color of these nationalities at the time, the definition of Caucasian had to be reinvented to focus the ideological category of whiteness on Northern and Western Europe. See, so because there were people who were considered white, and, to some North Africans, and I will say as an sidebar that Egyptians and Arabs are assigned white in the United States. They are considered white in the United States. So the darkest dark Egyptian is considered white in the United States. Yeah, for real. Yeah. So instead, it can be reasonably assumed Caucasian went through a number of trials through history before becoming the preferred identifier for white people in America until it was virtually dusted off and popularized once again to identify those who had previously openly identified as white and the white man for generations. Furthermore, a word whose origin came from the skewed taxonomy employed by Blumenbach for a geographical region separating Europe from Asia had no geo-ethnic relationship to Americans. Nevertheless, many in the US still consider Caucasian a legitimate descriptor. The resurgence of Caucasian as the most popular term for white and whiteness in a newly invisible colorblind paradigm allowed it to effectively and efficiently remove the color white from their skins without removing whiteness as superior as a state of being. In addition, Caucasian removed white from the idiolect of racialized American English discourse. In fact, today, in this era of US supremacist reckoning, anyone calling a white person white is considered among many as being racist, since the mere mention of the color white removes the cover of invisibility, exposing the skins of white people to their whiteness and all it represents in an otherwise normal colorblind nation. The crusade to change the nation's focus from systemic racism to individual behavior was one of the major objectives of the post racial colorblind era. Not only did the color white virtually disappear, labels introducing the so called real racist as angry, bald headed, swastika wearing, army booted white boys gave the power structures and well meaning white people additional cover. This cover provided the necessary face to redefine and redistinguish meanness and behavior as acts of racism. Therefore, white people who felt they no longer fit the stereotype of the real racist could be considered what? Normal Americans. In addition, Whiteness is directly linked to American culture and is based on an inescapable generational ideology of superiority. Many liberal and progressive white people who were trying to sanitize their status as superior backed this newly sanitized culture of normal, but only to the extent of normalizing whiteness. As a consequence of anything considered normal, when the criteria were considered traditional or typical, the need to include the color white within their concept of normal was no longer necessary. As a term to describe race as color and race as character without actually using the color white, they were also able to interchange normal with the euphemism traditional, where traditional itself was also based on generations old distinctions of whiteness. The culture, although supremacy to a quieter acquiescence of integration into white to be considered under neutral means characteristics firmly America was never neutral by any of the colorblind era. White people in government and many well-meaning white liberal that to keep discourse on these subjects neutral. For those who believe that racism have break segment and by simply eliminating the use of the term white, integration step alone had cured the ills of the nation. However, many who relied on defining and codifying race as individual behavior were intent on relegating behavior only to the most overt expressions as exhibited by groups like the Ku Klux Klan, various white vigilante groups. People while remaining visible, secure, and aware culture. Indeed, being neutral in American culture was intended to represent whiteness as no longer a threat to blackness, not more. The essence of this new neutrality was to assure the nation that the culture had become welcoming and the decades of open and violent racial animus were essentially over, absent those on the fringes, which, however, within the bleak recesses of existence for Black people, Teresa Guess alluded to the consequence of linking activity. She explained that by changing the neutral categorical character of racism, quote, agency into its implications on social relations, or the exertion of power being introduced. Neutral simply became another euphemism, hiding whiteness behind feigned color blindness and false notions of black as invisible, while race is character in social simultaneously rendering blackness socially and legally criminal, to be feared by themselves and white people as well. Of course, when we think of the word natural, there are various used to describe a person, place, or thing existence, produced in or by nature, not produced. When describing people, natural is of course see of the word natural as benign and abstract. One might be the point is give a color distinction at all. And why is the color creamy beige? What is it that makes creamy beige the logical choice for color? Why not a tawny brown? Have slate black? The answer to those questions should be as clear as other euphemisms set aside for encouraging the invisibility of the color, as such as the term nude. Although this term appears benign and abstract on its surface, it masks a sordid existence of racism, race as color, and superiority. Writer Crispin wrote in an article one race itself as the natural order. His definition of racism typifies a change in the way white American culture viewed naturality. Racism was expressed during the post-racial colorblind era, describing it as white racism, as though there were other forms in this country open to exploration. He wrote, quote, white racism is of half-formed ideas, pervasive mood, involuntary visceral responses. He wrote, in each era of American history, racism has taken on institutional embodiment that demonstrates continued vitality and provided a flashpoint for anti-racist action. Sartwell acknowledged the institutional embodiment of racism as well as corresponding flashpoints throughout the eras in American history, but he was careful to leave open the possibility of the irony. If there were Sartwell's acknowledgement was the fact that racism was indeed white only, with over here. In terms of the post, however, the embodiment of racism had virtually become exactly the complicated set of half-formed fear. See, this is the notion that anybody can be racist. And if you look in the dictionary presents racism as something that can be come from anybody. As is practiced here in the United States, is a system of equity in all areas of human activity. The continued vitality of this period for white racism was offered only on the fringes, among the good white people in the newly invisible, normal, and natural culture, who were now supposed to be compassed. The article suggests itself as the natural order in America without so much as white racism existed anywhere other than identity. while leaving open the idea that no rational explanation was provided for the existence of any form of racism. Nude is defined as reserved skin. It follows white people blindly through the post-racial colorblind era, not even considering how the physical representation, even using the word white. The invisibility familiarity of American culture during this period allowed whiteness to flourish in society in the form of items of clothing, including hosiery and bras and other items like nude also represented the absence of any color. Where tangible colorlessness were expressed at all, they were considered natural and reflected the creamy of white, since it was no longer necessary to convey superiority through and white. Whiteness as superior, whatever, not only everything which by default were normal, neutral, and natural, visible white privilege. One of the most prevalent euphemisms used today within the vocabulary of white supremacy and during the post racial colorblind era is privilege or white privilege. I discuss how it manifested itself as yet another quiet term to hide the insidiousness of whiteness as superior and racism in an essay entitled A Look into the White Centered Euphemistic World of White Supremacy and Racism, White Privilege. In essence, white privilege sounded better to white people, even as it generated contempt at the thought of receiving unearned privileges. For many white people angered over the upward economic mobility of black people, that distinction of privilege during the post-racial colorblind era was reserved for the entitled or uppity blacks. The term has fewer negative connotations than white supremacy or supremacist because privilege is an easier word to accept than superiority when discussed around issues of race. Let me repeat that. The term has fewer negative connotations than white supremacy or supremacist because privilege is an easier word to accept than superiority when discussed around issues of race. It also soothes the feelings of white people who would rather learn about all the benefits they are perceived to have over black people, even if those benefits are unearned, rather than their collective atrocities against black people. They can tangle around the details of its distinction to them as being superior or to refute and debate the efficacy of the term as applied to them. Good white people writhing in guilt can figuratively self-flagellate uh, about being privileged because they are now consciously accepting the truth of their dominance over black people, but without the requisite accountability or responsibility. They can show concern and sadness about the disparities without owning the blame, since as individuals they are the beneficiaries of a legacy, the inheritors, not the actual creators of the ideology which gave birth to the system producing the disparities. whether the term white privilege was a proverbial ruler used to smack the hands of those who believed they were superior because of their skin color, or thought they excelled because of their inherent merit, or didn't believe they had privilege at all, only to learn that there was actually something different in the way they were treated. One thing is clear: white privilege, as a term in American social and racial culture, had positioned itself as the one stop, two-word description of white people to distinguish them from being defined by other seamier terms in a racialized America. In fact, white privilege as it exists today is a term which can simultaneously pacify and anger white people, depending on how they choose to interpret it, which is itself a privilege. Spokesperson for white people, she had to individual white with I agree. What it's and privileges, however, it's the very fact of white supremacy idea. Unusual acts of in systems by post era than explained earlier. What color white both racist color and racist character to define people. For people like Miss McIntosh, systemic racism was invisible. She was conditioned to believe that individual acts of meanness on the basis of color was racism, and was and is still the case for many others. Many people think that just individual acts of meanness is racism. Most who shared her belief virtually switched the entire focus from the original purpose of the system of racism crafted after the enslavement to ensure white supremacy would be maintained. For clarity of the fundamental core of white privilege, just ask yourself this question. Pay close attention to this question. If during the enslavement, when there was no need for a system of structural, institutional barriers to guarantee the superiority of white people, what could have possibly been the driving force behind the enslavement, white people, and the treatment of the enslaved? Answered quite frankly, it was the dogma of whiteness and white people as superior to the enslaved black people, and that whiteness reigned supreme. No white person on the face of this earth wants to believe that their greatness, their achievements, anything than this hard work and, of course, their own merit. This is why many will not accept that a system was put into place to ensure the only competition for privileges, achievement, and greatness would be only among themselves. And then after the 1960s, primarily among themselves. If the brand of racism as defined today by white people was merely caused by individual acts of meanness, then how would those individual acts of meanness alone account for the delivery of their greatness, achievements, privileges, in addition to unearned entitlements? Obviously, meanness alone would not account for any of it. According to Miss McIntosh, she realized white privilege was due to invisible systems conferring dominance, suggesting something esoteric like the invisible hand. That explanation itself creates an unearned privilege all its own, of a feigned superiority in the use of the word conferring or bestowing. So while she was acknowledging what she was taught, she didn't refute what she was taught. Rather, she gave what she was taught status, a kind of stature to her inherent supremacy through the bestowing of indiscernible or invisible systems of white dominance. The use of the word dominance in itself also creates a superior connotation when used with the words white and invisible systems. Using the term privilege, nevertheless, doesn't negate the existence of those very real structural barriers within all of the institutions where white people work and make decisions. Accepting the knowledge of privilege without acknowledging the very ideology that allows such a frivolous notion of invisible systems of white dominance to exist as the reason is ludicrous. There are some major takeaways regarding white privilege in the United States. Here are four. It acknowledges the existence of unearned privilege in the United States on the basis of white skin color. It conveniently leaves out the root core ideology that white people use to create the system which sustains it. It effectively admits, accepts, and allows guilt for dominance and better treatment while leaving open the debate on the existence of racism as the cause of such privilege. Remember now, they calling it some sort of invisible, indiscernible thing that just is. Okay? White supremacy does not have to be addressed at all, since any discussion of privilege is only about white benefits, not white atrocities, which provides more than adequate cover for those atrocities. So when you hear white people talk in terms of white privilege, or you speak in terms of white privilege, what you're actually doing is you're acknowledging their dominance over us to the extent that, yes, they do have it better, but they're not owning why they have it better. Within the core of whiteness as superior, white privilege is the direct consequence of putting a system in place to deny and apportion equity, equality, opportunity, and justice for Black people. And racism is indeed the cause of white privilege. White supremacy is at the core of racism and white privilege. White privilege, as a catch all euphemism for white supremacy, allows white people to center themselves around their dominance of Black people. It allows for their privileged state of being white without having to be concerned with the reality of the atrocities which put them there, acknowledging instead an esoteric, indiscernible set of systems, an invisible hidden hand as the reason. Guests argued that aside from any authenticity within the realm of science, race as a social fact in which the social and political significance of whiteness plays a crucial role. Race is a social fact in which the social and political significance of whiteness plays a crucial role. Guess was in agreement with French sociologist and philosopher Emile Durkheim, who wrote, "A social fact is every way of acting, fixed or not, capable of exercising the individual and external constraint, or again, every way of acting which is general through a given society, while at the same time existing in its own right, independent of its individual manifestations." Yeah, it's a whole hell of a lot, I know. As the backdrop of Durkheim's definition of race as a social fact, Guess's argument, race, racism, and what has come to be called white skin privilege, could be conceptualized as properties or characteristics or the structuration of race relations, and that these social facts can also be argued as having become increasingly institutionalized features of American society since the 17th century. As a social fact, white privilege in the United States is apparently as normal and as common as all ways of behaving in white society and exists in its own right for white people. The adage, "it is what it is," applies. See, that's the point. The point that's being made is that they're saying that yes, it's part of the social fabric, and it's some sort of invisible esoteric something, a hidden hand. We don't know why it happens, why we have this privilege. We just have this privilege, and it just is what it is. The phrase "people of color" term colored people in the American English lexicon used to describe black people is considered a euphemistic term. Writing in 2014 for NPR's website publication, Code, as the late 18th century, Molesky included the Oxford Dictionary definition of the term in its earliest reference. A 1797 survey of the population of what is now Haiti described three classes of people, including the class which, by a strange abuse of language, is called people of color, originates from an intermixture of the whites and the blacks. So, the people of color back in those days were the biracial people. Isn't that interesting? At least in Haiti. According to the above reference, it could be seen the earliest use of the term people of color actually came from the idea of mixing the blood of black and white people. Isn't that interesting? That whole idea of black blood, white blood. I mean, come on. I mean, that's another lecture. Anyway, often mistaken for having used the term people of color, Dr. Martin Luther King is credited for having used at least something similar, substituting people for citizens. The fact is, the people of color distinction has always been a way to include race as color without actually referring to or using the color black, brown for Latino or Latina, and other non white Hispanic demographics, indigenous people, and practically anyone non white. While Asians are also considered people of color today, they are less often the people who come to mind immediately when the term is used. Diversity is a term which can be considered a euphemism for race as color. It's used primarily a way to corral all people considered others into one stall, much like the term people of color places every non white person into one huge classification simply for having. It is a gentler word than other or different. But I mean, if you look it up in the dictionary, it is defined one of the definitions before it became a racialized euphemism. Today, however, it has become a perfect word to include anyone who is non white, LGBTQ, disabled, speakers of English as a second, or any of the people discriminated against in this country. One thing is clear through diversity can be diverse or different and the diverse. It is important to note that Griggs' biography reads like an elitist handbook, descended from Mayflower pilgrims, and who was the author of President Truman's Marshall Plan. His Governor Bill Scranton, by his own admission, he considered himself a member of the white elite. His fascinating an elitist worldview. Although as a child I learned in my family that we were all under one God, I also got the very clear message that here on earth in the ones. As part of the Calvinist heritage that imbued the Puritans that settled in America, I was brought up to believe that my wealth, my class, my race of grace from God. However, it was incumbent upon me to be a privileged